November 14, 1888, marked the day the earth of Silver Creek first surrendered to the shovel of Silas Vance, a date etched into the town's history not for the gold extracted from the hills, but for the hole dug into the valley floor. The ground was hard, packed tight by a summer of drought that had turned the soil into something resembling iron. Yet Silas struck it with a rhythmic, hypnotic persistence that drew the attention of the passers-by. He was a man of few words and severe features, his face weathered like the sandstone cliffs that bordered the territory, and his hands were permanently dusted with the white ghost of flour. While the rest of Silver Creek was frantically erecting wooden storefronts and flimsy shanties to accommodate the influx of prospectors, Silas was digging down, carving a rectangular maw into the earth 20 feet from the main thoroughfare. The town of Silver Creek was a place of boom and bust, a settlement built on the fragile promise of quick riches, where men lived for the day and ignored the horizon. Mayor Horace Thorne, a man whose girth was a testament to his gluttony and whose suit was far too fine for the dusty streets, paused his daily promenade to peer into the pit Silas was excavating. "Building a cellar for your spirits, Vance?" Thorne called out, his voice booming with the jovial arrogance of a man who believed he owned the future. Silas did not stop his work immediately. He finished the arc of his swing, the pickaxe biting deep into the clay, before he looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag that lived in his back pocket. "No spirits, Mayor," Silas replied, his voice gravelly and flat. "Just bread," the mayor laughed, a wet, rattling sound that drew chuckles from his entourage. "Bread? You mean to bake for the worms? A bakery belongs on the street, man, with a window to tempt the hungry miners." Not buried like a coffin, Silas rested his hands on the handle of his tool, looking not at the mayor, but at the pale, watery sun hanging low in the sky. "Heat rises, Horace, and cold sinks. When the wolf comes, you'll want the heat to stay where the bread is." The mayor shook his head, dismissing the baker as touched in the head by the solitude of his trade. To the town, Silas was an oddity, a man who had arrived with money enough to build a palace but chose to live like a badger. They did not understand that Silas Vance had survived the Great Blizzard of '86 in the Dakotas, and he saw things in the geometry of the clouds that the gold-drunk miners refused to acknowledge. The construction of the underground bakery was a feat of engineering that defied the hasty, slapdash standards of the frontier. Silas did not merely dig a hole. He was constructing a fortress of thermal dynamics. Once the excavation reached a depth of 10 feet, he began the meticulous process of reinforcing the walls not with timber, which would rot and warp, but with river stones he hauled by hand from the creek bed, mortaring them with a mixture he fired himself. The townspeople watched the progress with a mixture of amusement and confusion, often gathering at the edge of the pit to jeer at the mole of Silver Creek. They watched as he constructed the ventilation system, a complex network of clay pipes that ran along the floor and up through the ceiling, designed to draw fresh air in and siphon smoke out without losing the precious heat of the oven. The oven itself was the heart of the structure, a massive, domed beast built from imported firebrick that Silas had spent his life savings to transport across the plains. It was not a standard oven. It was vast, capable of holding 50 loaves at a time, with a thermal mass so dense that once heated, it would hold its temperature for days. Silas worked with the precision of a watchmaker on a scale of tons. He aligned the flue to catch the prevailing draft, ensuring that even when buried, the fire would breathe. "Why all the stone, Vance?" asked a blacksmith named Jeb, who had stopped to watch Silas laying the arch of the oven door. "Wood is cheaper and faster." Silas didn't look up from his trowel, scraping the excess mortar with a sharp hiss. "Wood burns, Jeb. Stone endures. And stone remembers the heat." The skepticism of the town was rooted in their short-sightedness. They saw the labor as unnecessary suffering. They saw a man breaking his back to bury himself, while they threw up pine frames that swayed in the gentlest breeze. They called it Vance's tomb, joking that he was simply saving the undertaker the trouble. But Silas ignored the taunts, his eyes fixed on the barometer of the seasons, measuring the angle of the light and the thickening coats of the coyotes that skirted the edge of town. He knew that the earth was the only true insulator against the wrath that was brewing in the north. As the structure neared completion, the focus of Silas's labor shifted from construction to accumulation, a process that further baffled the residents of Silver Creek. The underground bakery was designed with a massive storage annex, a dry, cool chamber lined with cedar to repel moisture and pests. Into this chamber, Silas began to move mountains of supplies. He purchased entire wagon loads of hard red winter wheat, a grain known for its durability and protein content. Ignoring the softer, cheaper flours that the other merchants peddled, he bought barrels of molasses, sacks of salt, and huge quantities of dried fruit. Miller Jensen, the town's primary supplier of grain, scratched his head as he unloaded the 20th sack of flour into the chute that slid down into the bunker. "You expecting an army, Silas?" Jensen asked, dusting his hands on his apron. "This is enough flour to feed the town for 3 months. Assuming you could even sell that much bread from a hole in the ground." Silas stood at the bottom of the chute, stacking the heavy sacks on raised wooden pallets to ensure air circulation. "Not an army, Jensen," Silas said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "Just a long night." Jensen took the coin Silas offered, shaking his head. "You're a strange one. Weather's been mild for years. You're tying up capital in flour that'll likely go weevil-ridden before you bake a tenth of it." Silas paused, looking at a jar sitting on a shelf near the oven. His sourdough starter, a bubbling, living culture he had kept alive for 15 years. It was the soul of his operation, a wild yeast that required no commercial supply, only flour, water, and warmth. "The weather is a pendulum, Jensen," Silas said, checking the seal on a barrel of water. "It swings back. And when it does, it doesn't care about your capital." The preparation went beyond ingredients. Silas stockpiled cordwood, seasoned oak and hickory, stacking it floor to ceiling in the fuel alcove. He created a self-sufficient ecosystem beneath the boots of the town, a place where the variables of the outside world, the wind, the rain, the freezing cold, could be controlled. While the saloon owners diluted their whiskey to stretch profits, Silas concentrated his resources, preparing for a siege laid by nature itself. October bled into November, and the golden haze of autumn began to curdle into a steel-gray sullenness that hung over the valley. The signs were subtle to those who only looked for gold, but screamingly loud to a man who looked for survival. The elk herds moved down from the high country weeks earlier than usual, their breath steaming in the morning air. The woolly bear caterpillars were almost entirely black, a folklore sign of a severe winter that Silas took as seriously as any meteorological report. Above ground, the town of Silver Creek continued its raucous existence. The clatter of the piano from the Gilded Lily saloon spilled out into the street every night, competing with the drunken shouts of miners who had struck a vein or lost a fortune. Mayor Thorne held a town hall meeting in the square, standing on a crate to address the shivering crowd. "This winter," Thorne bellowed, wrapping his expensive wool coat tighter around his bulk, "will be a season of unprecedented growth. We have new investors from the east, and the mines are producing record yields. Let us not be deterred by a little frost." The crowd cheered, their breath rising in clouds, oblivious to the fact that the temperature was dropping 5 degrees every hour. Silas stood at the back of the crowd, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He had tried to warn the grocer, the livery owner, even the sheriff. He told them to reinforce their roofs, to stockpile coal, to cover their windows. They had laughed, pointing to the clear skies of the previous week. "You're a gloom-monger, Vance," the sheriff had said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Go back to your hole." Silas turned away from the mayor's speech, walking back toward the heavy oak trapdoor that marked the entrance to his sanctuary. He felt the shift in the air pressure, a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. The silence in the underground bakery was profound compared to the noise above. It was a sanctuary of stone and potential energy. He lit the kindling in the massive oven for a curing fire, the draft pulling the flame aggressively up the flue, a sign that the cold air outside was heavy and pushing down. The town was celebrating its own hubris, while 20 feet below, Silas was preparing the lifeboat. The crisis did not arrive with a whimper. It arrived with the violence of a derailed train. It was January 12, 1889, a day that would be etched into the tombstones of the frontier. The morning began deceptively mild, a Chinook wind that melted the top layer of snow and lulled the town into a false sense of security. Men went out in shirt sleeves. Windows were thrown open to air out the stale smoke of the winter. But Silas was below ground, sealing the secondary ventilation shafts and moving his water barrels closer to the oven wall. He knew the pattern. The warmth was the bait. At shortly past noon, the sky to the northwest turned a color that defied description. A bruised, angry purple that swallowed the horizon. The wind didn't pick up gradually. It hit the town as a solid wall of ice crystals moving at 60 miles an hour. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in 30 minutes. In the street, the sudden drop caused wood to snap with the sound of gunshots. Horses in the livery stable screamed as the flash freeze hit their wet coats. The blue norther had arrived. Inside the Gilded Lily, the windows shattered inward, spraying the patrons with glass and snow that felt like sand. Panic was instantaneous and absolute. Men scrambled to board up the openings, but the wind tore the planks from their frozen hands. Above the roar of the gale, the church bell clanged wildly, swung by the wind itself. Down in the bakery, the only sound was the deep, rhythmic roar of the fire in the oven and the settling of the earth. Silas checked the thermometer he had mounted near the entrance ladder. The mercury was dropping so fast it was visible to the naked eye. He didn't panic. He rolled up the sleeves of his heavy wool shirt and reached for the mother dough. It was time to bake. Not the delicate pastries of the city, but siege loaves. Dense, heavy rounds of bread packed with molasses and lard, designed to fuel the body against the consuming cold. Above him, the world was ending. The blizzard did not relent as night fell. It intensified, turning the town of Silver Creek into a graveyard of snowdrifts. The wind howled with a demonic persistence, driving snow through the cracks in the hastily built clapboard houses, piling drifts against doors until they could not be opened. Inside the shanties, stoves burned red hot but could not combat the draft that sucked the heat out through the walls. Water froze in basins within feet of the fire. The coal supplies, which the mayor had insisted were sufficient, dwindled rapidly as men burned through a week's ration in a single night just to keep their blood from congealing. By the second day, the Gilded Lily was silent, its windows boarded with tables. The patrons huddled together under buffalo robes, shivering violently as the temperature inside the saloon dropped below freezing. The town was being digested by the winter. By the third morning, the silence above ground was absolute, broken only by the relentless shrieking of the wind. The snow had buried the first floor of every structure on the main street. Inside the mayor's residence, the situation was critical. Horace Thorne sat wrapped in 3 coats, his breath pluming before his face, staring at the empty coal scuttle. His fine furniture had already been smashed and fed to the stove, but the fire was dying. Beside him, the sheriff nursed frostbitten fingers, his face gray with hypothermia. "We can't stay here, Horace," the sheriff rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The wood is gone. The walls are too thin. We'll be statues by morning." Thorne looked around his freezing parlor, the frost creeping across the floorboards like a living fungus. He thought of the gold in his safe, the deeds to the mines, the power he wielded, all of it utterly useless against the indifference of the storm. Then, a memory surfaced through the haze of his freezing mind. A memory of heat rising from a hole in the ground, of stone walls, of a man who had built a tomb that breathed smoke. "Vance?" Thorne muttered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. The baker, the sheriff looked up, confusion clouding his eyes. "The crazy one? He's probably dead in that hole." Thorne shook his head, struggling to his feet. "No," he said. "Heat rises." He said Stone remembers. It was a desperate gamble, a suicidal trudge through the whiteout, but the alternative was a quiet, freezing death. They gathered the few remaining survivors from the neighboring houses, Miller Jensen, the blacksmith, a handful of saloon girls wrapped in curtains, and prepared to move. They tied themselves together with a length of rope, a lifeline in the blinding white void. Stepping out of the shelter was like stepping into a physical blow. The wind knocked the breath from their lungs, and the cold was a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders. The journey to the underground bakery was less than 50 yards, yet it took them nearly an hour of agonizing struggle. The street was gone, replaced by a landscape of shifting dunes and blinding ice. They crawled over drifts that buried wagons, their faces wrapped in scarves that froze stiff with their own breath. Miller Jensen, who knew the location of the delivery chute, led the way, prodding the snow with a long iron rod. When the rod finally struck wood with a hollow thud, a weak cheer went up from the group, swallowed instantly by the gale. They fell to their knees, digging frantically with frozen hands, clearing the snow from the heavy oak trapdoor of the main entrance. It was buried under 4 feet of drift. Thorne's heart hammered against his ribs, not just from exertion, but from the terrifying thought that the door might be locked, or worse, that the bakery was a frozen tomb below. When the wood was finally exposed, Jensen hammered on it with the iron rod. "Vance!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Silas! Open up!" There was no answer. The wind roared, mocking their effort. Thorne slumped against the snow, the cold finally piercing his last layer of defense. Just as he closed his eyes, the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor turned. The wood groaned, pushing upward against the remaining snow, and a crack of light appeared, golden, impossible light. A blast of air escaped the opening, carrying a scent that brought tears to the frozen men's eyes. The smell of yeast, of toasted wheat, and above all, the overwhelming, life-affirming scent of heat. Silas Vance stood on the ladder, a lantern in one hand, looking up at the huddled, shivering mass of humanity. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply stepped down and gestured with a flour-dusted hand. "Close the door behind you," he said. "Don't let the heat out." Descending into the bakery was like passing through a portal into another world. The temperature differential was so extreme that the survivors gasped as the warmth hit them, their frozen skin prickling with the sudden rush of blood. The underground chamber was a fortress of comfort. The massive stone oven radiated a steady, deep heat that permeated the very air, warming the bones of the shivering townsfolk. The ventilation system hummed quietly, cycling the air so that despite the crowd, the atmosphere remained breathable, scented heavily with baking bread. Silas had not been idle. The shelves were stacked with hundreds of loaves, their crusts dark and thick. He had converted the storage annex into a makeshift dormitory, laying out flour sacks filled with straw for bedding. Mayor Thorne, stripped of his coat and his dignity, sat on a crate near the oven, his hands trembling as he held them out toward the firebrick. He looked at Silas, who was methodically slicing a loaf of warm bread with a serrated knife. The silence between the two men was heavy, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of their reversed fortunes. Silas handed a thick slice of bread to the mayor, then to the sheriff, and then to the saloon girls who were weeping softly in the corner. "Eat," Silas said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Chew slowly. Your bodies need to remember how to work." The bread was not light or airy. It was dense, slightly sour, and rich with the flavor of molasses and survival. To the starving, freezing townspeople, it was the finest meal they had ever tasted. I thought you were a fool, Vance," Thorne whispered, the crumbs clinging to his beard. "I laughed at you." Silas didn't look up from his work. He was checking the temperature of the dough rising in the wooden troughs. "You laughed at the winter, Horace," Silas replied quietly. "I just didn't join in the joke." For 6 days, the blizzard raged overhead, burying Silver Creek under 10 feet of snow. But underground, time was measured not by the storm, but by the rhythm of the bakery. The tomb had become the Arkansas. The hierarchy of the town dissolved within the stone walls. The mayor slept on a flour sack next to the blacksmith, and the saloon girls helped knead the dough alongside the miller. Silas was the captain of this subterranean ship, rationing the water, managing the fuel, and ensuring the oven never grew cold. He taught them the economy of movement, how to conserve energy, and how to respect the resources they had. The heat of the oven did more than keep them alive. It forged a new kind of community. They spoke in low voices, sharing stories not of gold strikes or gambling wins, but of families left back east, of fears, and of the simple gratitude for warmth. The irony was not lost on anyone. The gold they had chased was frozen in the ground, useless, while the wheat, the humble, overlooked grain, was the currency of life. On the seventh day, the howling of the wind finally ceased. A profound silence settled over the snow-packed trapdoor. Silas climbed the ladder, listening intently. He pushed against the wood, but the weight of the snow was too great. "Jeb Miller," he called down. "Grab the shovels." It took them 3 hours to tunnel up from the bakery, digging a shaft through the compacted drift until they broke the surface. The light that flooded down the shaft was blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off a world erased by white. When they finally emerged, blinking and squinting, the town of Silver Creek was unrecognizable. The shanties were crushed, roofs caved in under the weight of the snow. The Gilded Lily was a ruin of splintered wood and ice. The silence was absolute, save for the dripping of the melt that had just begun. But they were alive. 30 people stood on the roof of the buried bakery, breathing the crisp, cold air, looking out at the devastation with a mix of sorrow and profound relief. Mayor Thorne stood next to Silas, looking at the wreckage of his office across the street. He looked at his hands, which were still stained with the flour of the morning's baking. He turned to Silas, who was already scanning the horizon, looking for the next shift in the weather. There were no speeches, no grand declarations of heroism. The vindication of Silas Vance was not in words, but in the steam rising from the open trapdoor, a signal fire of civilization in a frozen wasteland. "We have to rebuild," Thorne said, his voice steady but stripped of its former bluster. "We have to build it right this time." He looked at the stone chimney of the bakery, standing defiant and undamaged against the skyline. "Like this?" Thorne added, placing a hand on the rough stone. "We build with stone," Silas nodded, pulling his collar up against the lingering chill. "Stone is good," Silas said, turning back to the trapdoor where the rest of the survivors were waiting for the next batch of bread. "But first we eat." The work starts tomorrow, and as the town of Silver Creek began the long, slow process of digging out, the smell of fresh sourdough drifted across the valley, a promise that while the winter was cruel, the human spirit, when baked with foresight and patience, was harder to break.